Hi everyone, this is Gina from Fibers and Design, and today we're going to talk about 10 mistakes that new weavers make and how you can avoid them. Let's get started. So, as you're first starting weaving, one of the most common problems of weaving that you might have is weaving straight. At the beginning, you might find yourself weaving in a kind of hourglass shape, and that's okay. It's okay to embrace this and enjoy the process of improving your weaving and making it straight. Now, how can you avoid this? One of the main ways that you can avoid this is by checking your tension. Checking the tension of the warp is really important during the beginning stages all the way to the end of weaving. At the beginning, when you're dressing the loom, be sure to go back and double check the tension. Another way to ensure that you're weaving straight is to balance the tension between the weft and the warp yarns. So how do you do that? One of the best and easiest ways to do that is when you send the weft yarn through, be sure that when you're using your fork or beater that you make these small hills or curves across the warp. This will make sure that the pressure from the weft yarns will be evenly dispersed. Number 2, color transitions. You might find it a little difficult at first for changing yarns or adding color to your techniques. There are some really great ways to making sure that the transition between the colors or sections of your weaving flow well together. Some ways that you can add color or add yarns together is by using the weft interlocking method, warp interlocking, and weaving slits. There are many other ways, but those are the most common ways or methods that I use, and I really enjoy using these, and they help transition the colors and the shapes, especially when you're just beginning. I really encourage you to experiment with a different type of methods so that you can pick the best that fits for you and for your project. Number 3, warp visibility. As you're weaving, you may have noticed that the weft yarns cover the warp, or at least that's your goal, depending on what you're weaving. If you're weaving a weft-faced project, then that means that you want the majority of the visibility to be of the weft yarns that you're weaving and not the warp. So you might have run into the problem that you can only see or you see a lot of the warp yarns, but you don't want to see it, right? There are 2 things that you can do to solve this issue. The first thing is checking your density. Is the density too high? Do you have too many ends per inch? The number of warp ends that you have can highly influence how it interacts with the weft yarns. So this is something to consider. The second thing is to check how hard you're beating down the weft yarns. Maybe it's not so consistent, and so you might have some yarns visible while others aren't in some sections. So you want to make sure that as you're beating down the weft yarns in place, that it's a consistent weight and pressure that you're placing on them. Number 4. Now you've been successful and you've woven all of the piece and you're so excited to take it off the loom. But oh no, the weft yarns on the top are way too loose and you find that your piece is kind of coming out or falling apart. There are a few things that you can consider to fix this problem. 1, at the top of your piece, when you're almost done, try using yarns that are a little bit thicker or of the same consistency of the warp yarns. Another thing that you can do is add a hem stitch. The hem stitch is used to secure the final rows of weft in your weaving. So at the top, I would recommend either using hem stitch or twining. These 2 weaving techniques help secure the weft yarns in place, and I think that it will help make your weaving more secure at the top. Number 5. Similar to number 3, we mentioned about the EPI or ends per inch. Depending on the numbers of ends that you have on your weaving, it can highly influence the design that you're weaving. It can make your weaving look more smooshed, or it can help define the things in your weaving. So you want to make sure that you're weaving with yarn and the number of yarn ends that work best with your weaving. This includes not only the warp yarns, but also the proper weft yarns that you're using. Think about the thickness and the material of both the warp yarns and weft yarns. A good solution to this might be sampling before you start a new project. Testing out a few inches of warp with the desired weft that you want to use will help you get a better feel and idea for the combinations of ends per inch that you should use and the type of pattern that you can use for the weft. Number 6. uneven warp tension. As mentioned before in number 1, it's important that you're consistently checking the warp tension, and it's quite visible when the warp is not taut enough. Now, what kind of problems can happen? Well, an uneven warp tension can result in the hourglass figure in your weaving, and it can also lead to uneven design or patterns in your weaving with the weft. So it's important that you're checking. Now, what can you do if you lose the warp tension? Well, if you're working with a lap loom, you can adjust the knobs at the top. And also, another great thing that you could do is creating a schedule that can help you finish your weaving a little bit faster. The longer the weaving or yarn stay on the warp, the less tension it's going to have. With more and more time, the tension goes down. Now, if you're using a frame loom like I am with just nails or pegs on it, then you will probably notice this as well. So that's one of my biggest recommendations, is that you try to stay on schedule with your weaving. Now again, you don't want to rush the creative process, but you should also think about the yarn and how long it can actually hold its own tension naturally. Number 7, oh no, a broken warp yarn. Don't worry, it's not the end of the world if this happens, but it will probably throw you off for a moment. Now, this can be solved, technically, it can be solved, and it shouldn't take too long to repair. If you find that your warp yarn has snapped somehow, with maybe you're using a very delicate material, then it's all right. You can use something such as a paper clip or maybe a toothpick to help hook the yarn together with the new yarn. And by inserting the yarn through the piece and then reconnecting it. In another tutorial, I can show you how to repair your warp yarn in just a few steps. Number 8. A skipped warp yarn. Depending on the pattern that you're creating, a skipped warp yarn can throw off the appearance that you're making. I like to say embrace the mistakes, because this is a hand-woven project. You know, we're human creating these things, and we're going to make mistakes, and that's kind of the beauty with weaving. But if again it really throws off the pattern that you're creating, or you can really see the difference, this is something that you can fix on when you're finished weaving. Once the weaving is off of the loom, you can go back with a tapestry needle and fix the mistake. Maybe you've missed a warp yarn and there's a little bump or error, and you can go back with the fabric that you've made. You can go back and reweave that section or just the one that's missing. Number 9, uneven weft tension. Now, this can happen when you're not pulling on the yarn enough. One of the most fun things to do on the loom is to put the weft yarn on it. But it's important to also keep the tension of the weft yarn while it's passing through the warp. You will find that there's a lot of tension and pull and tug between the warp yarn and the weft yarns, right? The warp yarns stay in place, holding the weft yarns in place, right? And the weft yarns want to have fun. So it's important that you kind of guide the weft yarns to stay obedient to the warp. Well, hopefully. Now, the way that you can do that is when you're passing the weft yarn through the warp, I like to pinch the edge of the warp. So the final warp yarn that you're using, and then pull it through. So you're kind of pinching the two warp and the weft yarns together. For example, when you're holding the next yarn, when the weft goes through here, I'm going to hold and pinch the weft yarn and the warp together so that it doesn't pull too much here, but also that it gives the weft yarn a base. The weft is free floating, but the warp, as you can see, the warp is staying in place because of the top and the bottom of the loom. However, the weft is free floating and we have to give it some support. So give the support with like a pinch, and it will help hold the weft in place and give it proper tension. Similar to number 6, uneven warp tension, this weft tension, it's important that when you send the weft through, that you make these small hills or curves to help even out the balance of the weft. And number 10, we made it! You might find that sometimes when you take the warp off of the loom, there is some bubbling that happens. It might not sit on its own and it needs some time to rest. I found that sometimes just taking the warp off of the loom helps it sit and relax. Oftentimes this helps it settle and it lays flat, but other times you might notice that it's bubbling. To get your weaving to stay flat is that you can soak it into water, to submerge it in water, and then lay it down on something flat. You can also put some pins in it so that it can lay and stay down. Here are the 10 mistakes that new frame weavers make and how we can solve them. Now, if you're looking for a little bit more information and more tutorials on how to solve these problems, I'm going to leave you a link down below with full tutorials on how to solve these problems. And for more weaving information, please check out the Fibers and Design website at fibersanddesign.com for even more weaving tutorials and help on weaving. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that this information helped, and if it did, please give a thumbs up and subscribe for even more weaving information. See you in the next one. Bye.